In this recipe, I'm creating an inverted puff pastry. An inverted puff pastry is one of my favourites. It doesn't rise like a traditional puff pastry, but it's much flakier and it doesn't need as much resting time in between what we call the turns. To start with, I'm going to create the dough. So firstly, I'm going to place the flour in the mixer. We're using the dough hook. If you haven't got a dough hook, you can either do this by hand or you can use a paddle attachment. Although the dough hook will be much easier for you to knead the dough and work the gluten. We're going to add in some unsalted butter, salt, vinegar. Vinegar helps to slow down the oxidization of the dough. So if you do this process over a couple of days, this will help to stop the dough oxidizing. Now we have water, it does say plus or minus. I would add at least 3/4 of the water at the start. It does vary how much water the dough will require, depending on the percentage of gluten in the flour. Now that can vary a little bit. There's always a slight difference from batch to batch in the volume of gluten. Once the dough starts coming together, you need to determine if it needs more water at the start of the mixing process. It's very difficult for the dough to incorporate water towards the end of the mixing process. We want the dough to be pliable and not too firm, but we also don't want it to be sticky. If it's sticky, it's quite easy to add a small amount of additional flour. I'm going to add in the remaining water at this stage to ensure that the dough is the right consistency. The mixing process can take up to 20 minutes. I'm going to show you how to test when the dough is actually ready. What we're looking for is for the gluten strands to be developed and they become quite elastic. So periodically take a small amount of dough. We've only just started the mixing process, so we haven't really started to develop too much of the gluten. Roll it into a ball, and what we're going to do is pull it out to make a nice clear window. If the dough actually breaks, which it will at this stage, we know that we haven't developed the gluten enough. You should be able to make a transparent window which you can actually see your fingers through. So you can see that that's tearing as soon as I go to stretch it to a transparent window. So once that becomes transparent, we know that we've developed the gluten enough and the dough is ready to remove from the mixer. Now I've had the dough mixing for approximately 20 minutes. So we're going to do another test. So just taking a small amount out, rolling it up, and then once again, just stretching it out to create that window. Just do it slowly. If you pull it apart too quickly, it will still tear. So you can see that that's stretching perfectly. You can see my fingers underneath. So it's become transparent without actually tearing, which is exactly what we're looking for. Once your dough reaches this consistency, we're going to remove it from the mixer. Just press the dough into an even flat square. We're going to wrap the dough. Normally with a classic puff pastry, we actually roll out the dough and place the butter on the inside. With this one, we're going to place the butter on the outside, which means we don't need as much resting time as we normally would for the dough because we're not actually rolling it out. We still will let this rest for approximately 20 minutes before assembling it together with the butter. We're now going on to the butter preparation. For the butter preparation, it's a combination of butter and flour to give the butter more stability and to enable us to handle it as it will be on the outside of the dough. So firstly, we're going to place the butter in the mixer. Plain flour. We're just going to mix those two on a low speed just until it comes to a pliable consistency. That's just come together. I'm going to spread it out on a guitar sheet. We need to make an equal square to which we'll put the dough inside. It's important that it's not only equal in thickness, but also a perfect square. If you haven't got the guitar sheet, You can use any sort of plastic sheet or you can use baking paper. I'm going to place another guitar sheet on top and then I'm going to start rolling it out. I trim it on the sides as I go to ensure that I get a nice even square. So just cutting off pieces if they get too close to the edge to ensure that you are going to have a square shape, and trim it in to bring it into a square shape, and don't do it at the last minute just as you finish. It is easier to roll this out when it's still quite cool. If it becomes too soft, when you put pressure on it, you won't get an even butter sheet. So you need to work in and out of the fridge, particularly if your room temperature is warm. We've rolled this out to approximately 35 centimeters by 35 centimeters square. At this point, we need to put it in the fridge for at least 5 to 10 minutes to enable the butter to firm up again before folding it over the dough. The butter has firmed up, so I'm going to remove the top guitar sheet. If you do have a lot of butter on that, just use a scraper, scrape it off and spread it back onto our butter sheet. This is what we call an envelope fold. I'm going to place the dough in and then fold in the corners so they just join and they don't overlap too much. I'm just going to roll the dough out slightly to even it out and to give me a slightly bigger square. Once you have the dough on, just test the butter, so pull it in to make sure that you've got the right dimensions with the dough and the butter is either not going to be too short or it's not going to overlap too much. Then fold the butter over. Just repeat the process with each side. Once you've got the dough completely sealed in the butter, don't be afraid to scrape it up if it becomes a little bit softer, and if it becomes too soft, you'll need to place it back in the fridge to firm up before bringing it back out. At this point, you need to put the preparation back in the fridge for 15 minutes just to enable the butter to firm up. If the butter has become really soft, it may need a little bit longer. You can leave the dough at this stage for a few hours if you have other things to do, but just keep in mind when you bring it back out, you need to allow the butter to soften a little bit before rolling. I'm going to use the same guitar sheet to wrap the dough. After we place that in the fridge and bring it back out, we're ready to do our first turn. We've placed the pastry wrapped in butter into the fridge so the butter can re-solidify to enable us to roll it out. When you bring it out, if the butter feels too firm, you will need to let it sit at room temperature for a few minutes until it becomes a little bit more pliable. If you roll it out when the butter is too rigid or hard, it'll actually crack and it won't completely coat the dough, so it'll actually ruin our layers later on down the track when we bake the pastry. For this first stage, you need to be quite liberal and generous with the amount of flour that you use because the butter can become quite moist when we're rolling it out. For the second rolling, after we've done our first lot of turns, you don't need to use as much flour. Just flour the top as well. Then we're just going to gently roll it out into a rectangle shape. We've basically got the width that we need. You can go a little bit wider. Now we're just going to create the length. Every couple of rolls, especially when you initially start, just turn the pastry over and make sure that it's really well dusted on both sides. Keep the dough as square as possible as you go. So just shape it as you're rolling it to ensure that it's not uneven when we're ready to do our first fold. We've got the pastry to the width and length that we need. It's approximately 65 to 70 centimeters in length and about 30 centimeters in width. You now have to brush off all the excess flour to ensure that the layers actually adhere together. We're now going to bring each side in to meet in the center. This is what we call a double or a bookend turn. So we're going to do 3 double turns. Another style of doing it, which we often use with traditional pastry, is single turns, where we divide the dough into 3 and fold it into 3. So with this one, just bring both sides into the center. Just make sure it's even. Brush off the excess flour. And just pull the pastry up so that's nice and even and square. Fold it over once again. Make sure it's nice, level and even. This is what we call a double or a bookend turn. We need 3 of these. We're going to rest it for 20 to 30 minutes in between each turn. I place it in the fridge, but I bring it out of the fridge 5 minutes before I'm rolling it. So to mark how many turns we've done, we just press our knuckle in to indicate we've done 1 double turn. We've got 2 more to go. We're going to wrap the pastry back up, ready for the fridge. We've rested our puff pastry and I'm now ready to do a second double turn. You can rest the puff pastry for longer than 30 minutes if you want to leave it overnight. The longer you leave it in the fridge, the firmer the butter will become. So ensure that you give it enough time at room temperature to make it a pliable consistency without being too soft, ready to roll out. This time we don't require as much dusting flour because we've got a much thinner layer of butter on the outside. As a rule, the main direction we rolled the pastry before the previous turn was in this direction. So then we always roll it in the opposite direction to ensure that we don't stretch the gluten just one way. If you always roll it in the same direction, you'll find that when you bake your products, they will all bake and elongate in one direction and shrink on the sides. So a small amount of dusting flour on top, and we do exactly the same process. We've rolled the pastry out again. We're going to do our second double turn. Once again, just brushing off the excess flour. So that's our second double turn. So we just mark the pastry accordingly with 2 knuckle prints. We're going to wrap that once again, place it in the fridge for 20 to 30 minutes, let it sit out for 5 minutes before rolling it out and doing our last double turn. Once again, I've rested the pastry in the fridge. We're now ready for our final double turn. Just a light dust of flour. We're going to roll it out to a similar length and width. Once again, rolling mainly in the opposite direction. We do have to roll a little bit on the width, but not as much as the length. Now we've got the width and the length that we require. Once again, I'm just going to brush off the excess flour and do another double turn. Now I've rolled this pastry by hand. If you have a dough break, you'll get a much more uniform finish to your puff pastry. This is a base recipe, so we've finished all our folds. Once this pastry has rested once again for 20 to 30 minutes, it's ready to then roll out and cut in any desired size, shape, and then baked off. So I'm going to refer back to this video with some additional techniques and recipes which will incorporate the puff pastry that we've made in this video. So here we have our finished inverted puff pastry.